Hi friends, in this tutorial series we'll be implementing Spring Boot 3 security examples. So in one of the previous tutorials we saw that when we added the Spring Security dependency to the Spring Boot project, by default Spring Security it gets enabled. Also the Spring Security it makes use of the default username and password. But for production we'll not want to use the default username and password. Instead we'll want to use the custom credentials. So in this tutorial we'll see how to configure custom credentials for our Spring Boot 3 security application. For this I'll be taking reference of my website javanews.com. So go to Spring Boot 3. Here go to Spring Boot 3 basic security. The example that we'll be looking at today is Spring Boot 3 security custom credentials. In a previous tutorial we had implemented Spring Boot 3 security authentication simple example. So in this example we saw that on startup Spring Security it enabled the authentication by default. The default username was user and also the password it was created by Spring Security for us. Also in another previous tutorial using Spring Security configuration we had disabled Spring Security authentication. You can go through this tutorial here. In this tutorial we'll be modifying the Spring Security configuration to create custom username and password instead of using the default ones provided by Spring Security. So let us begin with the implementation part. So in previous tutorial we had implemented this example, Spring Boot 3 security authentication simple example. So here in this tutorial we had seen the in-depth working of Spring Security and Spring Boot 3. You can go through this tutorial here. We'll be downloading the example that we had implemented for this tutorial. So this source code, it will be the starting point for this tutorial. The source code project that I just downloaded, it is a Maven project. So import it in Eclipse. Right click on pom.xml and build it once. So this will get all the dependencies that we have specified in the pom.xml. So here we have the Spring Boot Starter web dependency and the Spring Boot Starter security dependencies. So here the build is successful. This will be the Maven project that we'll be having at the end of this tutorial. Before we start writing the code, let us first understand some Spring Security classes. The first class that we'll have a look at is the user class. So the Spring Security user class, it stores the username and password for the Spring Boot application. So on startup by default Spring Boot it has a default username user and a default password which gets printed in the console. So this username and password for the Spring Boot application they are stored in the user class. So go to Eclipse and here if we type Ctrl+Shift+T user, so here this is the class that we'll be interested in, Spring Security user class. So here it has the fields password and username which will be storing the username and password credentials for the Spring Boot application. Next we'll have a look at the class named user detail service. So this is actually an interface with a single method load user by username. This interface it has an implementation in-memory user details manager. This in-memory user details manager it has an instance of the Spring Security user class object. So we have already seen the Spring Security user class object. So the in-memory user details manager it has this user instance. Using the in-memory user details manager load user by username, we retrieve this user instance. So what happens is that during authentication, we call this load user by username method of in-memory user details manager, which gives us the user object which has the Spring Boot credentials, and then these credentials they are compared with the credentials entered by the user when he tries to log into the application. So if these credentials match, only then the user is able to log in. So we'll have a look at this whole process later. So let us have a look at this interface. So go to Eclipse, Ctrl+Shift+T, user details service. So here this is an interface with a single method load user by username. If we go to the implementation that we are interested in is the in-memory user details manager. So here in this load user by username, when we pass the username, it loads the user object. So this in-memory user details manager, it already has an instance of the user object, Spring Security user object here. The next Spring Security class that we'll be having a look at is the user details service auto configuration. So what this class does is that when we add the Spring Security dependency to the Spring Boot project and we provide no configuration for custom credentials, then this user detail service auto configuration it creates a user object for us, the Spring Security user object with the default username and password, and then it provides the in-memory user details manager class with this user object. Suppose the user he does not want to use the default username and password, instead he wants custom credentials. So in such a case, the user, he will create his own user detail service bean, and then the user detail service auto configuration, it gets automatically disabled. So in this case, we pass the new created user to the in-memory user details manager. Later we will see how this is done. Let us have a look at this class, user details. So user detail service auto configuration. So this class, if you'll see here, it provides the in-memory user details manager with the user object with the default username and password. And also, yes, if we want the Spring Security to use custom credentials, then here it is specified that this class, it can be disabled by providing a bean of type authentication manager, authentication provider, or the user detail service. So if you want to use a custom credentials, then we'll create a custom bean of type user detail service, then this class, it will not be loaded. And in this case, we'll need to provide the in-memory user details manager with a user object with the custom username and password, which we'll see later. The final Spring Security class that we'll be having a look at is the DAO authentication provider. So the DAO authentication provider is where the comparison between the credentials entered by the user and the Spring Boot credentials happen. So let us have a look at this class. So the DAO authentication provider, it has an authenticate method. It is in this authenticate method where the credentials entered by the user and the credentials of the Spring Boot application, they are compared, and if they match, only then the authentication is successful and the user he can proceed forward. So here in the authenticate method, we have the authentication object. This authentication object, it contains the credentials entered by the user in order to log into the Spring Boot application. Also here using the retrieve user method. So here using the retrieve user method, here we have the get user details service. So this get user details service is the in-memory user details manager. So we use the load user by username method to retrieve the Spring Security user object. The Spring Security user object, it contains the credentials of the Spring Boot application. So here we have the Spring Security user object and the authentication object, which has the credentials entered by the user. Both the credentials are compared, and if they are equal or if they match, then the authentication is successful. So next we'll be starting the Spring Boot application, and we'll be debugging and trying to understand how this takes place. So let us add some debug points. So the first, I'll be adding the debug point in the user detail service auto configuration. So I'll be adding a debug point here. Next, in the in-memory user details manager. Let us start the Spring Boot application. So in the user detail service auto configuration, since we have just added the Spring Security dependency and we have not configured the custom credentials, so here Spring Security, it will configure a user object with default username and password for us. So here it is creating a user with the default username. So it will be user, and also it will use the default password here and create a user object and provide it to the in-memory user details manager. So here in-memory user detail manager, it creates a user with the default username and password. Also the DAO authentication provider, it has an instance of the user detail service, that is the in-memory user details manager, which will later be used to retrieve this user object. So let us start. So this is the default password that gets created. Next we'll be adding the debug point in the authenticate method. So in this tutorial, we have created a REST controller where we have exposed a GET API with the endpoint /hello. We'll try to access this endpoint. If we go to localhost 8080/hello, here we are forwarded to the Spring Security login page. In first tutorial, we had seen how we get this login page. You can go through that tutorial here. So let us now enter the credentials. So user, the default username is user, and this is the password. Click on sign in. You'll see here we reach the authenticate method of the DAO authentication provider. So in the authentication object, we have the credentials that are entered by the user. So this is the password. Now let us add some more debug points. So in the here now we'll try to retrieve the Spring Security user object, which will be having the Spring Security credentials. So using the user detail service, that is the in-memory user details manager, will retrieve the user object which will be having the Spring Boot credentials. And then in the authenticate method, these are compared, and if everything is fine, then the user has successfully logged in. So if we go here, the user is here successfully logged in. So as we have seen previously, the user detail service auto configuration class, it is responsible for creating an object of type user with the default username and password and providing it to the in-memory user details manager. Now we do not want this. We do not want to make use of the user with the default username and password. So we'll be creating our own user object and providing it to our own in-memory user details manager, which will then be used by the DAO authentication provider. So in order to make use of the custom credentials for the Spring Boot application, we need to define a bean of type user detail service, that is the in-memory user details manager, and to this in-memory user details manager we'll be providing a user object with our own custom credentials. In previous tutorial using the Spring Security configuration, we had disabled Spring Security authentication. You can go through this tutorial here. So in this tutorial, we had created a Spring Security configuration class using the configuration annotation. In this class, we'll be creating a bean of type security filter chain. Also here we'll be telling Spring Security that do not apply default security, but instead make use of the security configuration that we have configured here. Also we configure Spring Security using the HTTP security object. So here in this configuration, we specify that all incoming HTTP requests, they are to be permitted, so no Spring Security should be applied. So for the current tutorial where we have to make use of the custom credentials, we'll be creating a similar security configuration and also similar bean of type security filter chain to define our own security configurations. So let us create a custom security configuration. Go to the Spring Boot application and here create a new class, security config. In the package, we can keep it as a root package only. So this class, it will be annotated with the configuration annotation. In the configuration class, we'll be creating a bean of type security filter chain, which will override the default Spring Security configurations. And here we'll be having the HTTP security object using which we'll be configuring the Spring Security. So here using the HTTP object, we specify that we want the form login. It means that whenever an unauthorized user is trying to log in, he will get a Spring Security login form. Next, we specify that all incoming requests, they are to be authenticated. So create this configuration. Next, we'll be creating a bean of type user detail service. So the in-memory user details manager, it extends the user detail service. So we'll be creating an instance of the in-memory user details manager. Also, we'll be creating an instance of the Spring Security user class with the username as Java in use, password as Java in use, and the authorities as read. This created instance will be passing it to the user detail service and will be returning this user detail service. So let us create this bean. So it will be the user class. So we are done with the changes. So let us now stop the application and start it again. So here the Spring Boot application, it has started, and also here we can see that in the console it has not printed any default password. So now go to localhost 8080/hello. Here we get the login page and the username will be Java in use and password will also be Java in use. We have configured this in the Spring Security configuration. If we click on sign in, we are not able to log in. So if we go and look at the console, here it is giving an exception. There is no password encoder map for the ID null. Spring Security 4, it allowed the storage of password in plain text using in-memory authentication. However, from Spring 5, it is necessary to specify password encoder for all the password that we specify in the Spring configuration. In a previous tutorial, we had seen what is bcrypt and how to use it with Spring Security. So you can go to this tutorial here. So in this tutorial, here I have given the video example. You can go through this. We had seen what is bcrypt and how to make use of it. So for this tutorial, in order for our password to work properly, we need to first define a bcrypt password encoder, and then when specifying the password in the Spring Boot configuration, we'll need to make use of this password encoder to encode the password and only then pass it to the configuration. So let us create this bcrypt password encoder bean. So create a bean of type bcrypt password encoder, import this. Next we make use of the encoder to encode the password. So we are done with the changes. Start the application again. Now go to the login form, just refresh this, and maybe we'll start the Spring Boot application in debug mode. Also here we'll be adding the debug point to the create user. So if you'll see in the Spring configuration that we have defined here, we define an instance of the in-memory user details manager. We create a user object and then we pass this user object to the create user method of the in-memory user details manager. So here we have the create user method. Just stop this and start it in the debug mode. So here now if you'll see the user that has been passed, it has the username as Java in use, and here the password, it is protected, so it is not showing. So start the application. So now if we type Java in use, the password also is Java in use. So here we are able to log into the application successfully. Hope you have understood this tutorial. You can download the source code that we developed for this tutorial by clicking on this link. Thank you.